Studio. It's a cloud-based IDE from Google. We talked about it last day. And for those who haven't been able to log in or get to this website, here's the link on the Google Meet chat. By opening Firebase Studio, you'll be greeted with this beautiful UI, which supports AI generating or prototyping with AI, and also a host of different technologies, including Go, Python, and more modern frameworks like Next.js, Node.js, and our very own Flutter. So just like last day, we'll just create our actual application. Now, you can name it whatever you want. I name it read log. That's upon you. If you have the workspace from last day, I would recommend continuing with it. If you don't, create a new one. So it takes a few minutes to set up. Okay, there's some issue. Okay, cool. So I think Firebase Studio has loaded up for me. You'll see that in Firebase Studio we have our Flutter project. Yes, Ashish. What's the issue? কি হয়েছে? Okay, by the way, if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute your mics or drop a comment or the text on the chat messages. Anyways, just recapping on last day, this is your default Flutter project, and our main code or the Dart code for our app lies inside this lib folder or the library folder. The pre-created file or the existing file over here is called main.dart, as we discussed last day, and it has the main function along with a simple widget that you can try out features of Flutter from. So I just go ahead and delete everything from this and write it from scratch. So just importing packages that we talked about, writing the main function, and then defining our widget, a stateless widget called my app. And that will just return a material app. All right, cool. So the material app, it will just have a title. Let's give it as read log for our actual application. And it will also have a home screen. So let's call it as home screen itself. Now you will see that home screen is highlighted. It's underlined with a red mark. So that means that Flutter can't really find what home screen is. So what we'll do is we'll create a new file called home_screen.dart, and we'll define our widget over here. So again, importing material.dart and then defining a stateful widget called home screen. Now we discussed the differences between stateful and stateless widgets. So if you don't remember, the basic difference between a stateful and a stateless widget is that stateful widgets allow you to keep track of the state. What we mean by that is stateful widgets allow you to dynamically reload your screen based on interactions or certain conditions. Now inside the home screen widget, we'll have a scaffold as we discussed last day, along with an app bar. So let's just define those two things first. and I want the title to be something like My Books. All right, cool. And I also want a color. So let's just keep the background color as yellow. So you see, I have successfully defined the scaffold, and the preview of this particular app will be available on the right hand panel in the device emulator. Now, if you see that the emulator is taking a lot of time, what you can do is you can switch over to the web version, which will load slightly faster. For example, my one was taking a lot of time, so I had to switch to the web one to keep things fast. Okay, cool. So we have our first UI. Now, next up, we want a means to add our books, right? We want some kind of a button or some kind of an option to add the books that we have read or that we want to keep track of. So Scaffold gives us a really cool button or a really cool place to put a button called a floating action button. Now the floating action button in general takes in any kind of widget that you want, but Flutter was very thoughtful. The Flutter team at Google was very thoughtful, and they gave us a ready-made widget for this, which is called a floating action button. And it has just one parameter, one required parameter, which is called the on press. So basically, we just need to define what the button will do when it's pressed. But a button without a label or without an icon, it doesn't really make any sense, right? So we must have some kind of a visual indication as to what the button does. So let's add a child property. And I want the child to be a simple icon. So a plus icon. To do that, we can just use the icon widget and tell it that I want this particular icon called add. And on refreshing, you will see that we were able to add a floating action button on the bottom right with a plus icon. Here it is. So similar to the actual design, I want the button to be yellow too. So what I can do is just get in over here and search if there are any options that relate to color. So I type color and there it is. We have a parameter called background color that will let us customize the background color of the button. Really simple, right? So maybe let's make this particular button as green. So colors.green. And when I save it, you'll see that the UI refreshes and the color is set to green. There it is. Awesome. So are we following up to this point? अगर किया होगा तो just give me a thumbs up. Also, guys, if you have any doubts of any sorts, please do ask because I didn't get any reactions. कोई reactions नहीं मिला मुझे. So So I'm going to assume that all of you understood and move forward with the UI. So, all right. So next up, the only other thing that we need to do in this entire UI is to really add a place to show the different books that we have added. So for that, we have the body parameter inside scaffold widget, which accepts a column. For us, it's a column. Next up, we'll just have to supply it with a list of children, a list of widgets. So I want it to be a text of, suppose, the first book that comes to your mind. I would suggest you guys do it yourself to understand it better. So suppose I add a book and another and another. So once I save this, you will see that the UI updates and we have two different texts in the column. All right, cool. Now, again, as we discussed last day, we needed a padding, right? It wasn't really looking good when the text was very close to the border. So we'll add a padding, and I'll put it to 16 pixels for now. So now that the UI looks all right, we must think of adding functionality. Now, the way to add functionality is we can take some sort of a list. We can take some sort of a list like this, as a list of strings called my book list, and initialize it with an empty string, with an empty set of brackets, just to denote that it's an empty list. Now, instead of displaying the text like this, we can use a different widget called a list builder or a list view. Cool. So list view is very similar to a column, but it allows you to have a dynamic number of elements. So it allows you to add in different number of elements whenever you want. And it takes in one required parameter, which is called an item builder. Now, whenever you just go in here and just hover over it, you will see that this is a function that takes in a build context and an int. Now, what are these, right? We all know int, but what is a build context? So before that, let's just actually write it. So this is the layout actually. This is the syntax for defining the item builder function. And it actually asks us to return some kind of a value. So a particular string maybe. So my string index. Now coming to context. So build context is a very Flutter specific way of telling the app about some of the important things that are going around it. So for example, what's the size of the screen, or which screen are we on? So things like these are contained within the context or the build context object. You might choose to read a bit more about the build context object or the build context class. So for that, I would suggest head over to Flutter documentation. So flutter.dev, docs.flutter.dev. I'll paste the link on the chats for you guys if you want to check out the documentation, which again, I highly recommend you to do. So the other parameter that this particular list view takes is an item count. So essentially telling the list view how many items you might have. Now, let's start off with a static number of items or a fixed number of items and see how it works or see how it looks. All right, cool. So now that you can see, we have a lot of different text on our screen. We have precisely 10 different text widgets on our screen. And every widget is containing the text my string followed by a number. You all have seen how arrays and other lists have zero-based indexing. So similarly, Dart also has zero-based indexing for lists. And therefore, we see the 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on till 9. But how do we really add data that we want into this app? So for that, we can make use of this particular list. We can make use of this particular list. So instead of item count, we can add the item count to be my book list.length, and we can add the text to be my book list and the index. So just accessing a particular element from the book list. And if I go in here and book 1 and I press book 2 and another book, I do this and I refresh. So you'll see instead of the 10 different texts that were on the screen, will be shown book 1, book 2, and another book, just like here. Now this is all cool, right? We now have a means to dynamically show text, and we know that it works very well, right? So we know we can display some amount of widgets in a dynamic fashion inside our body. So cool. Now, what about adding new values into this particular list? So how would you do that? So for that, we will use this onPressed function that we defined earlier inside the floating action button. So over here, we'll use the set state function that we saw last day, which allows us to dynamically rebuild our widget tree, that to be more precise. So just write set state and Flutter autocomplete will take care of everything else. So set state is a function that will need some amount of details. So what details? So you have to tell set state what exactly is it that you want to change in this particular UI. So me, for example, I want to add this particular text called book ABC into the list as many times as I press the plus icon. So I can do that by just typing my book list dot add and a value of book A, B, and C. So once I do this and I refresh my UI, we'll be greeted with the same 3 books again, but this time we'll have the option to dynamically add another book. So as many times as you press the plus icon, you will be able to add a new book. So pretty cool, right? Now I want everyone to do this, at least this much, and give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you didn't understand. Then we can move forward. Yeah, Shlok, बताओ. Shlok, you raised your hand. So if you have a question, open your mic or okay. So chat box. What if you want to change the heading title when you press a button? Well, that is completely possible. So again, we'll be using variables for that too. So suppose we add a different variable called a string, my heading, and initialize it to my books for now. So what you want is to basically change the particular title from my books to maybe something else. So let's just try it. So we can reset my heading to something like Shubhanu's books. So that should be sufficient. Now, once I rerun this, you will see that the button can be pressed. However, no change in the UI is occurring. So why is that? That's because we are changing the value of my heading, but we really aren't using the value. So to fix that, we can just replace this static text inside the title to the variable my heading. And once we hit refresh, you will see that we can now automatically change the title. So Shlok, understood? Was it okay? Okay, cool. So now this actually works very similar in a very similar fashion for all other places. So you would define a variable and you would change it to reflect on your app's screen. So anyone else have any other questions regarding this or regarding what we have done till now? गाइस प्लीज यार रिएक्शंस वगैरह कुछ भी कर दो, हमें भी समझ में आ जाएगा कि कुछ गया या सारा ऊपर से गया. Okay, so we have two questions. Now edge insets, as we can see inside the padding, well, it is just a class that is defined by Flutter, and it exposes us to some very important properties of paddings. So I'll just go ahead, and once we write edge insets, you see we have all of these different options. We have from LTRB, from view padding, only, and finally symmetric. So all of these are different ways of adding padding. So if I try symmetric and give horizontal as 36 and vertical as 4, and I refresh it, you will see that the horizontal padding or the left and right border padding is set to 36 pixels. However, the top and bottom padding is just set to 4 pixels right here. So that is exactly what Edge Insets does. It exposes you to a couple of predefined options to add padding into your widget tree. Okay, cool. Okay. Now the object is asking, what if you want to add different data in the list? All right. So that's what we are actually going to proceed to. Now let's just change it back to my books. And initially, let's keep the my book list as empty so that we can actually add our stuff in here. Awesome. So in Flutter, there are a couple of ways that you can use user inputs. One of them is by using something called a dialogue. Something called a dialogue. So we are going to use a dialogue to take a user's input as to what book they have read. So let's just go with this function called show dialogue. All right. Now you see, Flutter autocomplete has taken care of a lot of things for us. We are already supplied with the build context, and we have a parameter called builder. Now this is really similar to the item builder function in list view. So we just need to go in over here and hover over this particular parameter. So we see that it requires a function with build context. So let's do that. Let's add in a function with build context and add in this. So this similarly just needs us to add a return. All right. So we'll do that. Give me a second. Okay. So as you can see over here, we have defined the builder method. The builder method takes in a context, and the context is needed so that Flutter really knows where or how to open the particular dialogue. Now, we have all seen dialogues in different mobile applications, right? So the small pop-ups that come onto the screen and let you interact or inform you about some things. So that is what a dialogue is. Now, I have just added a title to the dialogue and a means to add a particular text. All right. So that is done using the text field. That's done using the text field. Now, once we click refresh, we would technically be able to add user data, so custom data that we want into our list. Okay, cool. So let's add my book 1. Okay, so now you see that we were successfully able to add in our data, but instead of having one entry, we have a host of different entries. So why is that? So if you notice very closely, we have defined a function or used a function inside the text field called onChanged. Now, once we hover over it, we'll see that it takes in a string value. It takes in a string value and does not really need a return type. So it's a void function. Now, the name itself is really self-explanatory. So an onChange function will be triggered whenever a particular data changes inside the app. So to keep track of that, we can really come to the output and see whenever I typed the words or the characters, my book one, they were listed as is. So whenever the text field was changed, my list was updated. So I don't really want that, right? No one wants so many entries. So what we do is we add a controller, a controller into the text field. Now, what is a controller? So it's just a means to store the value of a text field or edit the value of a text field. Now in Flutter, there are multiple types of controller, but for our text field, we need something called a text editing controller. Now we can name it whatever we want. I have named it as controller, and I am going to assign it to the controller parameter of our text field. Now that we have done this, we just need to add a button, right? A button that will let us save it or let us finish off with it. So for that, we have an actions parameter. So inside over here, you can define whatever actions that you want to do with your dialogue. So maybe I want a text button inside, and the text button will just close the padding or close the alert dialog. So let's just keep the child as close, wrap it in a text, and okay. Once I refresh the UI, you will see that a button has appeared on the top side of our dialog. So yeah, here. Now, right now, none of the functions are associated with it. There's no function associated with it. Hence, there's no use of clicking it. But we really want to associate some functionality with it, right? So we want to close the dialog whenever we are pressing the word close. So for that, we can use this very simple syntax called navigator.pop. So navigator is another class defined by Flutter that allows you to move from one page to another page. Now, using the pop function of the navigator and supplying it with a context, we can tell Flutter that I want to go out of the particular screen that we are in. So now if we refresh the UI, you will see that we can close the dialog whenever we press close. So there it is. We can close the dialog. Now similarly, we would want to save it also, right? We would want to save the detail. So instead of a text button, we can add a filled button and rename it to save. Now inside the on pressed, we again need to show or change the state of the application. So we'll use a set state just like this. Just like we have added over here. And we'll just write the code that we had previously written as mybooklist.add some value into the list. Now, how do we get the value from the controller or from the text field? So it's very simple. We just take the controller and use the text property from it. Once we save this and refresh the UI, we'll be successful in adding whatever text or whatever user defined books into the list. So maybe I want to add this particular book, 48 Laws of Power, and I do a save. Wait, what? Okay, I'm really sorry. We would need to add the set state inside the dialog, after, inside the on pressed, to make this actually work. So just using the set state, we add this, and finally we would actually like to close the dialog after adding the text, right? So we can just add the navigator.pop context. Now once we refresh the UI, we'll finally have a decent and working method of adding user data into our app and displaying it. So with fingers crossed, we'll try to make it work. So there it is. Beautiful. We have the means to write our data. So if we now add Lord of the Rings into our text, we see that we have Lord of the Rings inside our list. So pretty cool, right? Are we clear with this part on how we actually added the data into our application? Why does this not need us to refresh each time? Shlok, which does not need to refresh each time? Could you clarify that? You mean why don't we have to refresh the list again and again, like do the refresh again and again to make the list appear? Is that so? Okay, okay, cool. So basically, since we're using a stateful widget, we can rebuild the widget whenever we want using the set state function. So we can redraw all the components again and again whenever we want, when using set state or a stateful widget. Now, if you look closely, when I use a set state function, I write my book list dot add controller dot text. So what we are essentially doing is adding a value into a list called my book list. And if we scroll down the UI, we'll see that a particular layout, a particular widget is dependent on the my book list, which is the list view.builder. The list view.builder will create exactly the number of items that are there inside the book list. So inside my book list, as you can see, we have used my book list dot length. And inside the item builder, we are just returning the text in a we're just returning the value in a text widget. So whenever we are pressing this particular button and we are adding a new book, maybe like The Godfather, and I press save, the set state function is triggered and the list is uploaded or updated, and the UI is rebuilt accordingly. Is it clear so far? Yes, the set state changes it on the go. That's correct. Shlok, you were saying something. Okay, so it really. Okay, now here's the difference between a program and the widget. Basically, what set state does is it rebuilds this widget only. The home screen widget is redrawn. Okay, so Flutter actually differs from other cross-platform frameworks like React Native or Ionic, or even more late, like, or even newer ones like Kotlin multi-platform, because Flutter actually redraws each of the components, or draws each of the components into the screen rather than just placing them. So only the ones that are associated with the particular value that is changing are rebuilt. So yes, that's how the set state works under the hood. Okay, cool. So now the only other thing that we actually have to do is beautifying it. So for that, we can simply use a container or a card. I would like to use a card. And that's it. Or maybe I'll just add a row and add an icon to it. So adding an icon, like icons.book, and we will have to add a spacing, right? So the row and column widgets, they give us a property called spacing. So we can give that to 16 for now. And I'll also like to add a spacing, or a padding just below the card. So add a padding and just use only at the bottom, and let's keep it to 8 for now. All right, cool. Now once we rerun the application or refresh the UI, we'll be able to see all the changes that we have made, and the app will start looking somewhat decent. So there it is. Now we have a card instead of a simple text widget. All right. Now the process of beautification really begins over here, and your creativity is the limit. So you might add something like uh, a margin. So basically, the amount of spacing between the internal elements and the outside border of the card. So this again takes an edge insets, and I'll just add it to be 16 pixels. I just use it to be 16 pixels. And you can see that we have a pretty decent UI now. All right. Okay. What the hell? Okay. So I'm sorry, I was mistaken. Flutter keeps on changing, so the API documentation or the syntax really changes from time to time. It seems that we can't do it anymore like this, and instead we have to wrap the row or the internal contents with a padding widget, which again isn't really difficult. And you guys can imagine how it would look. So there would be just some spacing between the text and the icon and the border or the card in the background. So there it is. That looks pretty decent, right? Doesn't look the best, but it looks manageable. So that's it, guys. We'll not really move any more than this for today. And by the next session, by the end of the next session, we'll complete this entire application, and we'll also complete the process of beautification. And if time permits, we might also add support for storing these in your actual device, so local storage. All right. Up till now, if you guys have any question, uh, Shlok, definitely I will share a GitHub link. So if you want that of the actual app, and okay, yeah. So it will be there in the Google developer group, like community. All right, for everyone to view and edit. So that's all with the questions. I would like to give back the presentation and the meeting to Shoptoshida to conclude.
Yeah, sure. Thank you everyone. Thank you for joining today. So we will again resume this session tomorrow at 7:30. Yeah. Good night everyone.